Today I have a wild story about an HOA member who pretended I owned my house just so she could score some free parking. The kicker? I'm not even a member of this HOA. Let's jump right into it. This first story is titled, Am I the Villain? For standing up to our overreaching HOA board. So, 3 years ago, my wife and I moved into what we thought was the perfect suburban neighborhood. The homes were beautiful, the streets were spotless, and everyone seemed welcoming. We were aware of the HOA, but the rules seemed pretty fair at first glance. Oh, how naive we were. The first sign of trouble popped up 6 months after we settled in. My wife, an avid gardener, decided to plant a small vegetable garden in our backyard. Just a few tomatoes, cucumbers, and some herbs. One day, while I was at work, she called me, clearly upset. "Honey, we got a letter from the HOA." She said, her voice trembling. "They're threatening to hit us with a $500 fine because someone reported our garden." I was baffled. There was nothing in the HOA guidelines that specifically banned vegetable gardens. I immediately called the HOA president, a woman I'll refer to as Mrs. President. She informed me that they had been using drones to inspect properties and had found several violations. "Wait a minute," I cut in. "You're using drones to surveil people's backyards?" Interestingly, I've heard similar claims in HOA discussions on Reddit that they use drones to monitor homeowners. It's astonishing. Mrs. President called it Community Standard Enforcement Surveillance. Apparently, the board had voted on this at last month's meeting and included it in the newsletter. I went back and checked. It was hidden on page 12 of a 15-page newsletter, written in tiny print. That's when I knew I had to start documenting everything. The drone surveillance was just the tip of the iceberg. The board kept rolling out increasingly absurd rules. One morning, I opened my front door to find a $200 fine slapped on it because my car had been parked on the street overnight. When I showed up at the next board meeting to contest the fine, Mrs. President smugly declared that street parking was prohibited for aesthetic purposes. "But what if we have guests?" another homeowner chimed in. Mrs. President simply replied, "They can park in your driveway or garage. If that doesn't work for you, maybe this isn't the right neighborhood for you." The garbage can rule was the next level of absurdity in our neighborhood. They required that everyone bring their bins in within just 15 minutes of pickup. The catch? The pickup times varied each week, and they weren't about to provide a set schedule. People found themselves glued to their windows, waiting for the garbage truck, and then sprinting out to retrieve their bins. My neighbor, a retired teacher in his 70s, ended up with 3 fines because he simply couldn't move fast enough to comply with their unreasonable time limit. When he attempted to appeal those fines, they doubled the penalties. But the tipping point came when my neighbors across the street, a young couple with 2 kids, found themselves sued by the HOA. Their offense? They dared to replace their 30-year-old drafty windows with energy-efficient ones. The board claimed the new window frames were the wrong shade of actual cream. Yes, you read that right. Wrong shade of actual cream, not white, not beige. The couple spent thousands defending themselves in court, only to lose due to some obscure clause about maintaining what the board called architectural harmony. They were forced to replace all their windows again, plunging them into significant debt. At that moment, I had enough. As an accountant by trade, I decided to dig into the HOA's financial records, which they were legally obligated to share with homeowners. It wasn't easy. They lost my first 3 requests for documentation, but what I uncovered was eye-opening. The board had been mismanaging our dues, using funds to pay consulting fees to companies owned by their relatives. They were also selectively enforcing rules, letting friends off the hook while cracking down on others. Determined to make a change, I connected with other frustrated neighbors, and we formed a coalition. We hired a lawyer who specialized in HOA law and was horrified by what she found. The drone surveillance alone raised serious privacy concerns, but combined with the financial mismanagement and selective enforcement, we felt like we had a solid case. When we filed our lawsuit, we included everything: The illegal surveillance, the financial misconduct, arbitrary rule changes without proper notice, and the selective enforcement. 28 households joined as plaintiffs. The board's response was exactly what we expected. They tried to intimidate us. They sent threatening letters, increased property patrols, and even attempted to rush through an emergency measure to prevent homeowners from joining class action lawsuits against the HOA. The court battle stretched on for 8 months. The turning point came when we presented footage of board members using the HOA drone to spy on a teenager sunbathing. It was a blatant invasion of privacy and a potentially criminal act. The judge was outraged, and in the end, we emerged victorious. The entire board had no choice but to resign, leading the court to appoint a receiver to handle the HOA until new elections could be arranged. In a significant turn of events, the drone program was permanently shut down, and all fines issued over the past year were declared invalid. The investigation into the financial misconduct is still ongoing, with discussions of potential criminal charges for certain board members. We held new elections just last month. The new board consists of reasonable individuals who recognize that an HOA should uplift the community rather than intimidate it. Interestingly, one of their first decisions was to approve the original window installation for the young couple down the street and to reimburse their legal fees through the HOA's insurance. On a personal note, my wife's vegetable garden has flourished, and she's even started a community gardening club. The retired teacher next door no longer has to rush to put away his garbage bins. Overall, the neighborhood's atmosphere has undergone a remarkable transformation. People are out and about chatting with their neighbors, and children are playing in the streets. Now, here's the main reason I'm posting. Last week, Mrs. President's daughter came to my doorstep in tears, accusing me of ruining her mother's life. It turns out that the investigation into the financial misconduct uncovered that Mrs. President had been embezzling funds to support her gambling addiction. She's facing criminal charges now, and her daughter blamed me for tearing their family apart. What struck me the most was her insistence that her mom was only trying to maintain a nice neighborhood, saying the rules weren't that bad and that I could have just moved if I disagreed with them. I held my ground and told her that her mother chose to abuse her power and break the law. Those decisions were hers alone, and I simply revealed the truth. She left in a huff. But now some neighbors, particularly friends of the old board, are suggesting that I went too far. They argue that I should have tried to resolve things privately instead of ruining lives. A former board member's wife even confronted my wife at the grocery store, claiming her husband lost his job after the HOA scandal was exposed. Legally, I believe we did the right thing, but witnessing the personal consequences has been hard. Despite their wrongdoings, these people are still our neighbors. Their children attend school with ours, and we often run into them at local shops. The mood feels strange now, as if the community is split into those impacted positively by the lawsuit and those negatively affected. So, am I the bad guy for taking down the HOA board and exposing their crimes, knowing the personal fallout it would have on their families? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Do you think I acted like a jerk here or not? Personally, I feel I did the right thing. It's clear to me that if someone's violating HOA regulations, they ought to face some sort of penalty for their actions. You can't act like you're in charge and then just shrug off the consequences when they come knocking. Take the top Reddit comment, for instance. It claims you're not the bad guy here. In fact, they even called you a hero. Honestly, using drones to surveil people's backyards is just plain unsettling. Your actions probably kept the neighborhood from spiraling into something oppressive. But then there's another commenter who states you're in the wrong. This reaction shows why whistleblowers often face backlash. Sure, the board didn't handle everything perfectly, but did you really have to expose them the way you did? The president is struggling with a gambling addiction. It's a serious issue that deserves support, not public shame. You could have approached this matter privately rather than airing everyone's dirty laundry. Now, families are feeling the fallout, kids could be facing bullying at school, and the neighborhood is fractured. How do you feel about that, Captain Justice? Yet, another commenter supports your stance, saying you're not the bad guy. As someone who's older, I can relate to how infuriating those garbage can rules are. Forcing elderly residents to get outside in 15 minutes could lead to accidents. Your intervention likely prevented someone from getting hurt. A different comment suggests that everyone's at fault here. Yes, the previous board was corrupt and needed to go, but your approach was more like a wrecking ball than a thoughtful plan. Instead of rallying support for change, you went straight to extremes. Even if they broke the law, you seemed a bit too gleeful watching their lives unravel. The drone surveillance was invasive, and the financial misdeeds unacceptable, but perhaps you could have allowed them a dignified exit before dragging in lawyers and the media. Being right doesn't always mean handling things the right way. And, hey everyone, if you've stuck around this long, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any of my daily content. The next video is titled, HOA, Karen Tries to Claim My Home for Free Parking. My wife and I were on the lookout for a while, taking our time to make a decision we would be happy with. 2 years ago, we found a lovely house that my wife adored, but I discovered it had a really strict HOA, so we opted not to move there. Fast forward 2 years, we were exploring again and found another home in the same area. This time, there was no HOA at all. I was taken aback. I never thought I'd see an HOA just disappear. We were quite taken with the house and interpreted the dissolution of the HOA as a potential indication that we should proceed with the purchase. I inquired with our new neighbors, who were welcoming and friendly, about the circumstances surrounding the HOA that had previously existed. They informed me that the HOA had been quite unpopular, and its disbandment was officially attributed to mismanagement. However, not everyone accepted this explanation. Numerous rumors circulated regarding the true reasons for its dissolution. Although the HOA was no longer in existence, its presence lingered in the neighborhood through various signs and remnants. There was a notice box located by a park where announcements were posted, and although it was locked, one could still view the final letter indicating that it would be the last meeting ever held. Additionally, signs indicating resident parking only were still visible in several locations, including in front of our driveway, and the city seemed slow to remove them, compared to other matters. Among our neighbors, there is one individual I find particularly unlikable. She embodies the stereotype of a difficult person, often referred to as a Karen. She appears indifferent to those around her and is entirely self-absorbed. She frequently speaks loudly on her phone in public, engages in unnecessary arguments, and admonishes children for riding their bikes on a street adjacent to her home. Surprisingly, her family is even more challenging to deal with, as they seem to gather for every minor occasion, further amplifying her disruptive presence. Initially, I found the situation quite displeasing due to the boisterous nature of each family member, who appeared to be increasingly self-important. Their noise levels persisted into the early morning hours, disturbing those attempting to rest. Additionally, they displayed a disregard for cleanliness, leaving refuse and cigarette remnants on any lawn they chose. However, my primary concern with her and her family does not stem from these issues. Rather, it is their apparent belief that they can park wherever they please. It took several instances before they decided that my spacious driveway was an ideal location for their vehicles. They parked both in front of it and directly within it, managing to fit approximately 4 cars, or 5 if one was used to obstruct access. Initially, I attempted to address the matter politely, informing them that my driveway was private and that they were not permitted to park there. In hindsight, my effort to be courteous was misguided, as it resulted in a swift onslaught of verbal hostility directed at me for my single remark. They insisted that they had the right to park there and dismissed my concerns, with one individual suggesting that I should be thankful for their presence and labeling me a terrible neighbor. Eventually, the matriarch of the family approached to ascertain the cause of the disturbance, with several relatives indicating me as the source of the issue. All I had done was inform them of the parking restrictions in my driveway. The matriarch, seemingly unaware of the local regulations, pointed to a sign indicating resident parking only for the homeowners association. I clarified that this association no longer existed. Thus, even if such a rule had been applicable in the past, it was no longer valid. I suggested they relocate their vehicles to the street, where ample space was available. This suggestion appeared to trigger an intense reaction from them, escalating the situation further. If I thought they were overreacting before, that was nothing compared to the noise they were making now. Apparently, I had insulted them by suggesting that their precious cars could be parked on the street without turning into a disaster. Just to clarify, there was plenty of parking available on the street that would fit all their cars without anyone needing to hike a mile to Karen's house. Recognizing that this situation was only going to escalate, I decided to say something that I knew would make me their enemy, but hopefully resolve the issue. At this point, their cars were parked inside and blocking my driveway, and I was ready for them to move, immediately. They weren't paying attention, and Karen had just one last thing to say to me. "Your house is part of the HOA, that means you have to share the parking. In fact, I have the paperwork right here showing that your address is on the directory." That was all the justification she needed. She was convinced those cars weren't budging until they felt like it. "So I suggest you get comfortable," she added. I replied calmly. "There is no HOA here. Your guests need to move their cars." But Karen and her fellow Karens just laughed, then headed back inside to enjoy their party. I wasn't about to spend my morning trying to roust a bunch of hungover guests so I could leave. Instead, I waited about 2 hours until I was sure they were all nicely intoxicated. Then, I called a towing company to report 5 cars blocking my driveway. They sent a guy out who confirmed that none of those cars were mine and that they were on my private property. He began loading up the cars for towing. Since his flatbed could only hold 3 at a time, he brought along another truck and driver, anticipating the 5-car situation. Just as the last car was being loaded onto the tow truck, Karen and her family came rushing out of the house, yelling for us to stop. They were trying to reason with the drivers, insisting that I had never asked them to move their cars, and that they would take care of it if we unloaded them. It was obvious to everyone that they were inebriated and not fit to drive, even briefly. The drivers explained this to them, reiterating that the vehicles were secured on the truck and wouldn't be coming off until we reached the tow yard. Karen argued that they were legally parked according to the HOA rules, citing a sign as evidence. The driver informed her that, regardless, it was my private property, and the only recourse she had was to take legal action against me. That's when Karen turned her ire towards me, realizing her attempts with the drivers were futile. She began to shout, creating quite the spectacle. She accused me of lying, claiming I had given them permission to park there and that I was intentionally ruining her celebration. In her drunken state, she yelled that everyone was simply envious of her fabulous parties and just wanted to spoil her fun because we were never invited. Soon, her family members joined in, hurling insults at me from all sides. Karen proclaimed herself the rightful owner of my home and property, asserting that her connection to the homeowners association entitled her to free parking on my premises. As they continued their tirade, they even attempted to physically block the tow trucks to prevent the cars from being taken away. I can't say who called the cops, but they showed up right in the thick of the chaos, and I could swear Karen looked relieved. "Officer, please, you have to stop this man. He's trying to tow my family's cars," she pleaded. The officer responded, "All right, hold on." "You called the tow trucks, did you?" "Yes, I did. They parked their cars in my driveway and, despite my requests, refused to move them. I needed to get my cars out in the morning, and given how much they were drinking, it wasn't happening. So, I had them towed." "That's a lie. Just look at the sign," Karen retorted. "The HOA states that this parking is for residents and he needs to share it." I pointed out, "I have documents showing the HOA was dissolved 2 years ago. Would you like to see them, officer?" The officer examined both the sign and my papers and confirmed that the HOA no longer existed, giving Karen no standing to impose her will. The officer added, "Even if the sign were valid, it likely refers to street parking. Driveways are private property. Besides, those cars belong to guests, not residents. You can either persuade your family to move their cars and let the tow trucks do their job, or I'll have no choice but to arrest everyone involved." Karen seemed ready to continue the argument but ultimately decided to have her family retreat. They received warnings about trespassing and advice from the tow truck driver regarding where they could retrieve their cars once they sobered up. The entire situation completely deflated her party, which was amusing. Her guests couldn't even drive away. I felt a sense of satisfaction and wasn't bothered by the fact that Karen would probably have something nasty to say about me the next day. Spoiler alert, she did. I heard it took a significant amount of time and money for her to reclaim her cars after that incident. My relationship with Karen has since been strained. She's made snide comments and claimed to everyone that I was jealous of her and had misled the police. Yet, since that day, nobody has blocked my driveway again. As long as they learned their lesson about crossing boundaries, I was content. Now, I'm starting to wonder if those resident parking signs were really meant for driveways, possibly contributing to the HOA's downfall in the first place. Anyway, the next story is from R. Amithy Asshole, titled, "Am I the Jerk for Selling My Family Home Because My Pregnant Sister-in-Law Ate My Dinner?" Just to clarify, my brother and I have different fathers, so I'm a 19-year-old female who lost my dad to cancer last year. He left me 90% of his assets, including the family home that had been passed down for over a century. My older brother, age 34, didn't have a relationship with our dad, but did receive $10,000 in the will. My mom was furious during the will reading, but since she got $10,000, she couldn't contest it. For the past year, my mom and I have been getting by together. She continued to act as if the house belonged to her, which was fine until May, when my brother and his girlfriend, who is 30, moved in without even asking me. They exhibit a lack of cleanliness, a sense of entitlement, and rudeness. I informed them in July of my desire for them to vacate the premises by September, as they contribute nothing financially and do not even wash a dish. In August, they announced that they were expecting a child, and my sister-in-law smugly remarked that it seems they would not be moving out after all. This news was not well received. When I expressed my wish for them to leave, my mother and brother responded with laughter, dismissing my concerns. The subsequent months have been incredibly challenging, as their behavior has deteriorated further, with my mother enabling them and insisting that I treat my sister-in-law with utmost care due to her pregnancy. There was an instance where I had to wait outside McDonald's until it opened just to buy her a McMuffin. I acknowledge that I may have been inconsiderate, as my sister-in-law's cravings lead her to consume everything in sight, including all 6 cupcakes my friend made for my birthday, leaving me with none. I am unable to prepare my lunch the night before, as it will inevitably be taken by her. She often wears a smug expression while rubbing her belly, laughing and claiming, "I couldn't help myself. Blame the baby." If I attempt to store food in my room, my mother will use the spare key to enter, allowing my sister-in-law access to my mini-fridge. Recently, I found myself running late for college, unable to prepare breakfast or lunch, and had to head straight to work afterward. On that particular day, I had only a bar of chocolate to sustain me. Upon returning home, I found myself extremely hungry. As I prepared dinner, I stepped away to use the bathroom, believing I would be gone for no more than 10 minutes. However, when I emerged, I discovered that my dinner had been consumed to the extent of 70% by my sibling. Naturally, I became quite upset, which prompted her to start crying. My mother and brother then began to yell at me for my reaction, insisting that it was my fault for leaving food accessible and that she was unable to control herself. Feeling overwhelmed, I demanded that they leave, just as I had done previously. Although I faced ridicule for my decision, I recalled that in October, my uncle had offered me a substantial sum for the house. A few days ago, I reached out to him in tears, detailing my predicament, and he agreed to purchase the house but insisted on evicting my mother and brother. Their reaction was understandably negative, and I have since been staying with a friend. I have received numerous messages and have been tagged in various social media posts. This situation has led me to question whether I am in the wrong for making my mother and brother homeless. Commenter number 1 stated that I am not at fault, emphasizing that they have disrespected me and did not treat me as family, so I am not obligated to reciprocate that treatment. Commenter number 2 echoed this sentiment, suggesting that selling the house and witnessing their eviction would be justified, as family loyalty is meaningless when one is treated poorly. Commenter number 3 also supported my stance, recommending that I should have sought legal action due to what appeared to be emotional abuse. In conclusion, I agree with the perspective that I am not the one at fault in this situation. I am eager to hear your thoughts on this matter. Now let us proceed to an update regarding the situation. I'm taking a moment to sort through some things. Gotta admit, some of your roasts had me laughing. I really do deserve them with how off my grammar can be. If I end up selling the house to my uncle, I'll take a hit of $100K, but he's been nothing but good to me. I'd feel more at ease knowing it stays within my dad's family. My mom pointed out that given my age, trying to evict them might not be taken seriously. If I did evict them and kept living there, I'd probably be facing some serious tension and expenses. Plus, my mom's dealing with health issues, and my sister-in-law will have to move back with her parents, who won't let my brother stay, so it would mean splitting up a family, according to my mom. And yeah, Ripe Stars, it's too bad there are no updates on this situation. It's truly complicated for OP. However, he owns the house, so it's ultimately his call. Others have made a good point as well. His family hasn't treated him well. Before we finish this up, let's dive into a funny story from r/petty revenge. This one's called Send a Sexy Message from My Boss to a Customer. So, I used to work in a restaurant that turned into a bar in the evenings. The brunch crowd was always bustling, but evenings were usually a ghost town. That was my bartending shift. Just so you know, I was nicknamed 2650 because, 1 night I managed to sell just $26.50 worth of drinks in 6 hours. With barely anyone coming in, I often got roped into prepping for the brunch crowd the next day. Cracking eggs, peeling potatoes, and of course, rolling up cutlery. For those who might not know, when you get your silverware wrapped in a napkin, at a restaurant, that's what we call a roll-up. And someone has to do that hundreds of times by hand. My boss, to be honest, was a jerk who seemed to take pleasure in piling on the worst tasks, like cleaning toilets. The night before he left, he had been particularly annoying. Since the restaurant was small and I knew he'd be handling brunch, the next morning, I decided to have a little fun. In one of the roll-ups, I scribbled something like, "I think you're hot. Would you go out with me?" Check 1, yes or no. I even included his phone number just for kicks. Then I tossed it into the stack for the morning rush and headed home. The next day, I got a text that said, "You're such a damn mother trucker." That was awesome. But still, you're a mother trucker. Apparently, a couple had come in and my boss had handed the roll-up to the guy, who looked completely thrown off and asked if it was meant for him or his girlfriend. My boss had no idea what was going on, so he was just as confused when this guy handed him back a napkin with his own number on it. It turned out to be hilarious. And hey folks, if you can't get enough of my content, be sure to check out my podcast playlist. I'll see you tomorrow.